Oliver Ward stared at the tracks in the mud, his weathered hands trembling as he measured the width with his outstretched fingers. 23 inches across. No creature he knew left marks like these. The deep impressions curved through his pasture like a river of destruction, leading straight toward the dark swamp that bordered his ranch. His prize cattle were missing, and now he understood why. Emma found him there an hour past dawn, crouched beside the largest track, his face pale as winter snow. She'd never seen her husband look afraid, not in 30 years of marriage, not when rustlers came calling, not when the drought nearly broke them. But this morning, something had shaken Oliver Ward to his core. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like this?" she whispered, stepping carefully around the deep impressions that scarred their land. Oliver stood slowly, dirt still clinging to his knees. The kind that shouldn't exist. His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. "These tracks, they're fresh, made sometime during the night." He pointed toward the swamp. "Whatever did this took 3 of our best steers, dragged them whole into that cursed marsh." The evidence was undeniable. Broken fence posts told the story of something massive forcing its way through barriers meant to contain livestock. Patches of strange, musky scent lingered in the morning air, unlike anything either of them had encountered. Deep gouges in the earth showed where something had coiled and twisted, something far larger than any snake had a right to be. Emma clutched his arm. "We should fetch the sheriff, or that tracker from town. James Crow. He knows the swamp better than anyone." But Oliver was already walking toward the house, his jaw set with familiar determination. "By the time we round up help, the trail will be cold. Whatever's out there, it's not finished with us." He paused at the porch steps, studying the line of destruction that cut across his property like a scar. "I've worked this land my whole life, Emma. Built everything we have with these hands. I won't let some creature destroy it all." Inside the house, Oliver pulled his rifle from above the mantelpiece, checking the mechanism with practiced movements. The morning sun slanted through the windows, but shadows seemed to gather in the corners despite the light. Emma watched him load cartridges with steady fingers, though she noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward the swamp. "You don't even know what you're hunting," she said quietly. Oliver shouldered the rifle and met her gaze. "I know it's big enough to take a full-grown steer. I know it's bold enough to hunt this close to the house. And I know—" He hesitated, studying the tracks visible through their window. "I know it's not done hunting." The silence stretched between them until a sound drifted across the marsh. Low, rumbling, like nothing either of them had ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration that made the windows rattle softly in their frames. Oliver's grip tightened on his rifle. Whatever was out there had just announced its presence, and it sounded hungry. The edge of the swamp loomed before Oliver like a wall of green darkness. Spanish moss hung like curtains from ancient cypress trees, their gnarled roots disappearing into black water that reflected nothing. The tracks led directly into this maze of waterways and shadows, where a man could lose himself forever. Oliver waded into the shallows, his boots sinking into soft mud that tried to hold him with every step. The water was warmer than he'd expected, and something about its murky depths made his skin crawl. Branches scraped against his hat as he followed the trail deeper into the marsh, each step taking him further from the solid ground of his ranch. The tracks were easier to follow here. Whatever had made them was heavy enough to leave deep impressions, even in the waterlogged soil. Oliver knelt beside a particularly clear print, studying the strange pattern. It wasn't like any snake track he'd seen, yet the undulating path suggested something that moved by coiling and uncoiling its massive body. A splash echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by the sound of something large moving through the water. Oliver froze, listening. The noise came again, deliberate, purposeful. Something was moving parallel to his position, staying just out of sight behind the curtain of moss and branches. He raised his rifle, finger finding the trigger as he scanned the murky channels ahead. The silence stretched until even the normal sounds of the swamp seemed to hold their breath. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the gentle lapping of water against the cypress roots had stopped. Then he saw it, a wake cutting through the dark water, too large and too straight to be made by any alligator. The disturbance moved with surprising speed, creating ripples that spread outward in perfect V-shapes. Whatever was beneath the surface was at least 30 feet long, possibly more. Oliver's heart hammered against his ribs as he tracked the movement with his rifle sight. The wake curved around a massive cypress, disappeared behind a tangle of roots, then emerged again closer to his position, much closer. The water beside him suddenly erupted. Oliver threw himself backward as something massive breached the surface, water cascading from scales the size of dinner plates. He caught a glimpse of a head as large as a barrel, yellow eyes that fixed on him with intelligent malice, before the creature vanished back into the depths. The water settled, but Oliver knew he was being watched, stalked. This thing wasn't just some oversized snake hunting livestock. It was a predator that had learned to be patient, to study its prey before striking. And right now, Oliver Ward was the prey. He backed toward higher ground, keeping his rifle trained on the water. But the creature had vanished as completely as if it had never been there. Only the ripples remained, spreading outward like accusations across the dark surface. Behind him, a branch snapped. Oliver spun around, rifle ready, but saw only empty marsh. When he turned back to the water, fresh ripples were spreading from a different location entirely. The thing was circling him, and Oliver was beginning to realize that he might have walked into a trap from which there was no escape. Oliver's boots slipped on the muddy bank as he scrambled toward a cluster of fallen logs. His rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands, though he'd carried it through countless hunts without effort. This was different. Every shadow could hide death. Every ripple might signal his end. The water behind him churned violently. Oliver spun around to see a section of what he'd thought was a floating log suddenly come alive. The massive snake's body, thick as a man's torso, rose from the marsh with water streaming from its dark scales. Its head emerged last, triangular, larger than a horse's skull, with eyes that tracked his every movement. Oliver fired. The shot echoed across the swamp like thunder, sending flocks of birds screaming into the sky. His bullet struck the creature's thick hide and bounced off, leaving only a shallow groove in scales that looked older than the trees around them. The snake hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a locomotive, and its massive coils began to move with terrifying speed. He ran, through knee-deep water, over rotting logs, past curtains of moss that slapped against his face. Behind him, the water exploded as the snake gave chase. Oliver could hear the massive body cutting through the marsh, could feel the vibrations of its movement through the ground beneath his feet. A thick cypress root caught his boot, sending him sprawling face first into the black water. He came up gasping, spitting mud and marsh water, his rifle somewhere in the muck beneath him. The snake was closing fast, its wake spreading across the entire width of the channel. Oliver's hand closed around a fallen branch, thick as his arm and heavy with waterlogged wood. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He hauled himself onto a half-submerged log just as the snake's head broke the surface where he'd been standing. The creature's yellow eyes fixed on him with what looked almost like amusement. It had been toying with him, Oliver realized. This massive predator could have taken him at any moment, but it was enjoying the hunt. The thought filled him with cold rage. "Come on then," he growled, raising the branch like a club. "Let's finish this." The snake's head swayed back and forth, studying him. Its forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. Oliver could see intelligence in those ancient eyes, could almost feel the creature calculating distances, angles, the best way to strike. Then it moved. Not the lightning-fast strike Oliver expected, but a slow, deliberate approach. The massive body began to coil around the log where he stood, each loop tightening the circle. Oliver swung his makeshift club at the nearest section of snake, feeling the impact jar his arms. The creature barely seemed to notice. Coil by coil, the snake was building a prison around him. Soon, there would be nowhere to run, nowhere to dodge. The massive predator was patient, methodical. It had done this before. Oliver looked around desperately for any advantage, any escape. The cypress trees rose like pillars around him, their thick roots creating a maze of hiding places. If he could reach one of those massive trunks, maybe climb high enough. The snake's head rose to his eye level, close enough that he could see his reflection in those yellow eyes. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing fangs as long as railroad spikes. Oliver gripped his branch tighter, knowing it was useless but refusing to die without a fight. Then he heard something that made his heart leap, the distant sound of a man calling his name. Someone was coming through the swamp, following his trail. But would they arrive in time to save him, or would they simply become the snake's next meal? James Crow's voice cut through the swamp like a blade. "Oliver, where are you?" The experienced tracker pushed through the hanging moss, his weathered face grim as he followed the obvious signs of struggle. Broken branches, churned mud, and the unmistakable tracks of something massive told a story he'd hoped never to see. Oliver tried to shout back, but the snake's coils had tightened around the log, restricting his movement. The massive creature's head swayed closer, its yellow eyes never leaving his face. Each breath became more difficult as the space around him grew smaller. "Here," Oliver managed to croak, his voice barely carrying across the water. "James, stay back. It's—" The snake struck, not at Oliver, but toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Its massive body uncoiled with shocking speed, leaving Oliver gasping on his precarious perch as the creature surged through the water toward this new threat. James appeared through the moss curtain, just as 30 feet of enraged serpent launched itself from the marsh. The tracker's eyes went wide, but his hands moved with practiced precision. His rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Each shot found its mark, striking the snake's head and neck, but the bullets seemed to do little more than anger the beast. The snake's momentum carried it onto the muddy bank where James stood. Its massive coils thrashed, sending sprays of black water in every direction. James dove sideways, rolling behind a fallen cypress as the creature's tail whipped through the space where he'd been standing. "Oliver," James shouted. "Can you move?" Oliver tested his limbs, finding them bruised but functional. The snake's sudden departure had freed him from his wooden prison, but he was still weaponless and surrounded by deep water. "I lost my rifle. It's somewhere in the mud." The snake had recovered from its charge and was now coiled between the 2 men, its head weaving back and forth as it decided which target posed the greater threat. Blood trickled from the bullet wounds on its neck, but they seemed to have only made it more dangerous. James studied the creature with the calculating gaze of a man who'd spent his life reading animal behavior. "It's territorial," he called to Oliver, "defending this part of the swamp. But it's also curious about us. That's why it didn't just kill you outright." "Curious?" Oliver couldn't believe what he was hearing. "It was about to crush me." "No," James said, never taking his eyes off the snake. "If it wanted you dead, you'd be dead. This thing is smart. It's trying to figure out what we are, whether we're a real threat to its territory." The snake's head turned toward James, and Oliver saw his chance. He slipped into the water as quietly as he could, searching the muddy bottom with his hands for his lost rifle. The murky water made it impossible to see, but he had to try. His fingers closed around familiar wood and metal. The rifle was waterlogged and probably useless, but it was better than nothing. He surfaced carefully, trying not to draw the creature's attention. The snake was focused entirely on James now, coiling itself for another strike. The tracker stood perfectly still, his rifle ready but not aimed, as if he was waiting for something. "Oliver," James said quietly, "when I give the word, you're going to shoot at its tail section. Not to kill it, but to distract it. Can you do that?" Oliver checked his rifle's action. Water poured from the barrel, but the mechanism still seemed to function. "I think so. But James, what are you planning?" The snake's head drew back, its massive body coiling like a spring under tension. James raised his rifle with deliberate slowness. "I'm planning to give this old serpent a reason to find somewhere else to live. Now!" James tossed a spare rifle to Oliver across the water. "Backup piece," he shouted. "Always carry 2 in snake country." Oliver caught the weapon and immediately fired, the bullet striking the snake's thick tail section. The massive creature whipped around with furious speed, confused by this attack from behind. In that instant of distraction, James made his move. The tracker didn't shoot at the snake. Instead, he fired 3 rapid shots into the water near the creature's head, the bullets creating explosive splashes that sent the serpent recoiling. Then he did something that made Oliver's blood run cold. He stepped into the water, wading directly toward the enraged predator. "James, what are you doing?" Oliver shouted, but the tracker was already knee-deep in the marsh, moving with purpose toward a specific section of the bank. The snake's head swiveled toward this new threat, its yellow eyes blazing with anger. Its massive coils gathered beneath it, preparing for a strike that would crush James like a twig. But James wasn't looking at the snake. He was studying the shoreline, searching for something Oliver couldn't see. "There," James muttered, raising his rifle toward a section of muddy bank behind the snake. "Right there." He fired. The bullet struck the bank with a wet thud, sending chunks of mud flying. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to shift. The entire section of bank where the snake had been coiled started to collapse. Decades of root rot and erosion had weakened the earth, and James's shot had found the critical point. Mud, rocks, and rotting logs tumbled into the water, creating a sudden avalanche that caught the massive serpent completely off guard. The snake thrashed wildly as its foundation disappeared beneath it. Its tail lashed out, striking a cypress trunk with enough force to shake the ancient tree. But the creature's own massive weight was working against it now, pulling it deeper into the collapsing bank. Oliver watched in amazement as the predator that had seemed so unstoppable moments before struggled against the shifting earth. The snake wasn't trapped. It was too powerful for that. But it was thoroughly confused and increasingly angry. "Now we move," James said, grabbing Oliver's arm. While it's distracted, they waded quickly through the shallows, putting distance between themselves and the thrashing serpent. Behind them, the creature's frustrated hisses echoed across the swamp as it fought free of the mudslide. "How did you know?" Oliver gasped as they reached firmer ground. "Spent 40 years in these swamps," James replied, reloading his rifle without breaking stride. "You learned to read the signs. That bank's been ready to collapse for months. Just needed the right push." A thunderous splash behind them announced that the snake had freed itself. Oliver looked back to see the massive creature's head rising from the disturbed water, its eyes scanning for the men who had humiliated it. "It's not giving up," Oliver said. James nodded grimly. "Territorial animals don't back down easy, but we've hurt its pride now, made it angry instead of curious. That changes everything." The snake began to move toward them again, but its approach was different now. More direct, more aggressive. The intelligent hunting behavior was gone, replaced by pure rage. "What do we do now?" Oliver asked, checking his rifle's action. The water had definitely affected its accuracy, but it might still fire. James studied the approaching creature, his weathered face thoughtful. "Now we use its anger against it. Angry animals make mistakes, and this old serpent is about to make a big one." The snake's massive body cut through the water like a living battering ram, headed straight for their position. Its yellow eyes burned with fury, and Oliver could see that James was right. The creature was no longer thinking, just reacting. "Get ready," James said quietly. "When I say run, you head for that big cypress behind us, and whatever you do, don't look back until you're 20 feet up that tree." Oliver's mouth went dry. "What about you?" James smiled grimly. "I'm going to teach this snake why it should have stayed in the deep swamp where it belongs." The massive serpent was almost upon them, its head raised high, preparing for a crushing strike that would end this chase once and for all. "Run!" James shouted. Oliver didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the massive cypress, its thick trunk promising safety if he could just reach it in time. Behind him, he heard James's rifle crack once, twice, then the sound of splashing as the tracker moved through the water. Oliver's boots found purchase on the cypress's gnarled roots, and he began to climb. The rough bark scraped against his hands, but he hauled himself upward branch by branch, not daring to look down until he was well above the waterline. When he finally risked a glance, his heart nearly stopped. James wasn't running. The experienced tracker was standing waist-deep in the water, directly in the path of the charging snake, his rifle aimed not at the creature, but at something beyond it. The massive serpent bore down on James like a freight train, its head raised high for a crushing strike. At the last possible second, James dove sideways, rolling behind a cluster of cypress knees that jutted up from the water like wooden spears. The snake's massive head crashed into the water where James had been standing, sending up a geyser that soaked everything within 20 feet. But James's real target became clear as his final shot rang out across the swamp. He'd aimed at a massive dead tree that had been leaning precariously over this section of the marsh. The bullet struck the rotted trunk at its weakest point, and the ancient giant began its slow, inevitable fall. The snake sensed the danger and tried to change direction, but its own momentum worked against it. 30 feet of angry serpent couldn't stop or turn quickly enough to avoid the falling timber. The dead tree crashed down with tremendous force, its massive trunk striking the water directly across the snake's back. The impact drove the creature deep underwater, sending waves rolling across the entire marsh. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the settling groans of the fallen tree. Then the water erupted. The snake rose from the depths, thrashing wildly. But something had changed. Its movements were different, less coordinated, more desperate. The falling tree had done what bullets couldn't. It had injured the massive predator. "It's hurt!" Oliver called from his perch. James emerged from behind the cypress knees, his rifle ready. "Backbone's probably cracked," he said, watching the snake's increasingly erratic movements. "Won't kill it, but it sure changed the odds." The wounded serpent tried to coil itself for another attack, but its rear section no longer responded properly. Its massive head swayed back and forth, confusion replacing the intelligent calculation that had made it so dangerous. "What now?" Oliver asked, still clinging to his tree. James studied the creature's labored movements. "Now we give it a choice. It can try to keep fighting two armed men in an environment that's turned against it." He raised his rifle, aiming carefully at the snake's head. "Or it can retreat to the deep swamp and heal." The snake seemed to understand. Its yellow eyes fixed on James for a long moment as if weighing its options. Then, with obvious effort, it began to move away from them, its damaged body leaving an irregular wake as it struggled toward the deeper channels of the marsh. "Is it over?" Oliver asked, beginning his careful descent from the cypress. James kept his rifle trained on the retreating serpent until it disappeared into the maze of waterways. "For now," he said. "But Oliver, that thing's going to remember us. And when it heals." The tracker's words hung in the air like a promise of future trouble. The walk back to solid ground felt like the longest journey of Oliver's life. Every shadow in the water made him tense. Every ripple could signal the return of their wounded enemy. James moved with the careful awareness of a man who knew the danger wasn't truly over. "How long have you known about it?" Oliver asked as they reached the edge of his pasture. James paused to clean mud from his rifle barrel. "Heard stories for years. Trappers going missing. Livestock vanishing near the deep swamp. Most folks figured it was just gators or black bears." He gestured toward the destruction that marked the snake's path across Oliver's land. "But gators don't leave tracks like those." Emma was waiting by the fence line, her face pale with worry. When she saw them emerge from the marsh, relief flooded her features. "Thank God," she whispered, running to embrace her husband. "I heard the shooting and thought, it's hurt, but not dead," Oliver said, holding her close. "James saved my life, but that thing's still out there." James studied the tracks that led back into the swamp. "It'll stay in the deep water for a while, maybe weeks while it heals. But injured animals are unpredictable. Could make it more dangerous when it does come back." "When?" Emma's voice carried a note of fear. "Not if." "Creatures like that live for decades, maybe longer," James explained. "It's claimed this territory, and that tree fall hurt its pride as much as its back. It won't forget what happened here." Oliver looked at his damaged fence, the churned earth where his prize cattle had been taken, the path of destruction that led to the dark heart of the swamp. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, was at the mercy of a wounded predator that could return at any time. "Then we'll be ready for it," he said finally. James nodded approvingly. "Smart man. I can teach you to read the signs, show you where it's likely to emerge from the marsh, and we'll need better weapons. Something with more stopping power than hunting rifles. There's an old cannon at the military depot in town," Emma suggested. "Left over from the war. Maybe we could—" "Too big," James interrupted, "and too slow. What we need is a plan that uses the swamp against it, like we did today. That creature's smart, but it's also proud. Pride makes for predictable behavior." Oliver walked to the fence line and stared out at the marsh where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient trees. Somewhere in those dark waters, a massive predator was nursing its wounds and plotting revenge. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange sense of resolution. "My grandfather built this ranch," he said quietly. "My father expanded it. I've spent my whole life making it better, stronger." He turned to face James and Emma. "I won't be driven from my land by any creature, no matter how big or dangerous." James smiled grimly. "Then we'd better start preparing, because when that snake comes back, and it will come back, it's going to be angry, desperate, and looking for payback." Emma took Oliver's hand, her grip firm despite her fear. "What do we do first?" James looked at the sun, which was already past its peak. "First we gather the neighbors. This isn't just your problem anymore. That thing could threaten every ranch in the valley. Then we start building defenses, setting traps, learning everything we can about how it hunts." Oliver nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders. "And if it comes back before we're ready?" James checked his rifle one more time before slinging it over his shoulder. "Then we'd better hope that tree hurt it worse than we thought, because next time, it won't underestimate us." The three of them stood at the edge of the swamp as shadows began to lengthen across the water. Somewhere in those depths, an ancient predator was planning its return. 3 weeks later, Oliver was ready. The neighbors had come, just as James predicted they would. Men who'd lost livestock, who'd heard the stories, who understood that this threat reached beyond any single ranch. Together, They'd built a series of barriers along the swamp's edge, deep trenches filled with sharpened stakes, elevated shooting platforms, and most importantly, a network of heavy steel traps designed to channel any large creature toward a killing ground of their choosing. Oliver stood on the platform he'd built near his damaged fence, watching the morning mist rise from the marsh. James crouched beside him, studying the water through a spyglass. Emma waited in the reinforced house, her own rifle loaded and ready. "There," James whispered, pointing toward a distant channel. "It's coming back." Oliver saw it then, a wake cutting through the black water, heading directly toward his land. The snake had healed enough to hunt again, and just as James had predicted, it was returning to settle the score. The massive serpent emerged from the swamp at the exact spot where it had first breached Oliver's fence. But this time, instead of solid ground, it found a carefully disguised pit, lined with iron spikes. The creature's massive body crashed through the false covering, and its roar of pain and fury echoed across the valley. The trap held, but barely. The snake's incredible strength bent the iron spikes, and its thrashing began to collapse the pit's walls. Oliver and James opened fire from their platform, their heavy rifles sending bullets into the creature's exposed flanks. Other ranchers emerged from concealed positions, adding their firepower to the barrage. The snake, trapped and wounded, fought with desperate ferocity. Its massive tail whipped free of the pit, smashing one of the shooting platforms to splinters. But the trap had done its work. The creature was contained, unable to use its size and speed to full advantage. For 20 minutes, the battle raged. The snake's incredible vitality kept it fighting long after any normal animal would have succumbed. But Oliver and his neighbors had prepared well, and their coordinated fire gradually wore down even this ancient predator. When the shooting finally stopped, the massive serpent lay still in the ruined pit. James approached carefully, rifle ready, but there was no movement from the enormous body. The threat that had terrorized the valley for generations was finally ended. "It's over," Oliver said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. In the months that followed, Oliver's ranch prospered like never before. Word spread about the rancher who'd faced down a monster and lived to tell the tale. Buyers came from 3 states to purchase cattle from the man brave enough to hunt in the deep swamp. But Oliver had learned something important in those dark waters. Some fights you don't look for, they find you. And when they do, you stand your ground, you trust your friends, and you use every advantage the land gives you. He never went into the swamp again. He didn't need to. The tracks that had once led to his fence now led away from it, and his cattle grazed safely in pastures that had been dangerous for far too long. Emma found him one evening, standing by the filled-in pit where the great snake had met its end. "Any regrets?" she asked. Oliver looked out at his peaceful land, then at the woman who'd stood by him through it all. "None," he said. "This is our home, and it's finally safe." The swamp still whispered its ancient secrets, but they no longer included threats to the Ward Ranch. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and determination collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
Sometimes life gives you a moment that feels simple. You act, you move, you tell yourself you did the right thing, and then that moment lingers. It changes shape in your memory. You see it in a quiet glance from your dog. You hear it in the stillness of the woods. You wonder if silence can hold a second heartbeat. This is the story of one such moment. A narrow trail, a couple nearing retirement, a whimper in the underbrush, and something else, something they almost didn't see. 2 animals, 1 decision, and a bond no one expected, not between humans, but between a baby bobcat and a frightened puppy. It began in the high deserts of Arizona, where the trees grow wide apart and the sky feels endless. It was meant to be a peaceful walk. It became a memory they would replay for months. And while this story might look like an animal rescue video, what followed was far more complicated, more emotional, more human. Because sometimes the smallest creatures hold the biggest questions, and sometimes saving one life means leaving something behind. Let me show you why they never stopped looking back. Elaine and Peter weren't the type to rush. That's one of the reasons they'd moved out here just east of the Coconino National Forest, where the pine air felt clean and the birds never seemed to be in a hurry. Retirement had slowed them down in the best ways. Mornings with coffee and birdsong, late walks under apricot skies. A rescue pup named Cody, always a few steps ahead, always doubling back to check on them. They called him their little scout. It was supposed to be a short hike that afternoon, the kind where you forget time exists. Cody had wandered a bit farther than usual, nose to the ground, tail stiff. Peter whistled gently, but Cody didn't come. Instead, they heard a sound, half bark, half whine, and then something else. Silence. Elaine picked up her pace. Cody was standing still at the edge of a dry creek bed, head tilted. At first, it looked like nothing, just shapes in the brush. A mess of fur, maybe some roadkill, but as they got closer, their breath caught. Two animals, one pup, one bobcat kitten, both lying still, both hurt. The puppy, a little smaller than Cody, had matted fur and a torn ear. His back paw bent inwards awkwardly, but his eyes blinked. His chest moved. He made a low, dry sound, barely a whimper. Elaine knelt, whispered to Peter. He's young, domestic. Just a few feet away, partly hidden in the thicket, was something else. A small, spotted form, more silent than still, one leg twisted unnaturally. No movement, just presence. Not dead, not alive. Something in between. A wild cat baby, probably a bobcat, fur dusted with pine needles. A faint twitch of the ear. Peter leaned in. We can't carry both. Elaine didn't speak. They had one thermal blanket, one carrier in the car. Their phones had no signal. The car was half a mile back. The sun was going down. They looked at each other, and without saying the words, the decision was made. The puppy was gently wrapped in Elaine's coat. Peter stayed behind, promised to return, just in case he said. But in his gut, he thought she's already gone. Cody stayed close on the walk back. Quiet. Watchful. At the ranger station, the young woman on duty took the injured pup inside, said they'd contact a local shelter, asked if there were others. Peter hesitated, then shook his head. No, he lied. That night, Elaine couldn't sleep. She kept hearing something that wasn't there, the sound of rustling or breathing or regret. Peter got up early the next morning, said nothing, took the same trail, alone this time. A warm pack slung over his shoulder. He returned 3 hours later, and to Elaine's shock, he had her in his arms. The bobcat was alive. Barely. He'd found her in the same spot, unmoved, but her chest rose barely perceptible. She didn't run, didn't blink. She just endured. Peter wrapped her, slowly, spoke gently. Whispered, we're late, but we're here. They drove her to a wildlife center in Flagstaff, where the staff said she'd been lucky to survive the night. Head trauma, likely neurological damage. 7 to 8 weeks old. No sign of a mother nearby. Not even a den. They'd name her Juniper for the branches that had covered her body and almost her story. The woman at the center, gray, braid-soft voice looked at them both. You made the right choice, she said. But Elaine wasn't so sure. Because here's the truth, when people see rescue animal videos, they often forget the hardest part. The part that comes before the story begins. The part with the impossible choice. The part where time is short and help is far. And sometimes you have to choose between a creature that trusts you and one that never will. Between the familiar and the wild. Between a puppy who looks at you with human-like eyes and a bobcat kitten who doesn't even flinch. They'd pick the puppy first, because he looked like he needed them, because he was soft and small and domestic, because he reminded them of Cody, and because deep down they didn't believe the bobcat would live. It wasn't a bad decision, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Most people would have done the same. That's what makes it worth telling. Wild animal rescue is full of moments like this, quiet, gray area moments where right and wrong don't feel so far apart. It's not always heroic. Sometimes it's hesitant, Sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it ends in regret. But what makes this story different is that it didn't end there. Because Juniper lived, and she wasn't just a wild cat baby. She was something else entirely. We'll talk more about the Wildlife Rescue Center later. The staff who worked late into the night. The vet who whispered instead of spoke. The volunteers who took turns sitting beside a creature who never purred, never growled, never asked to be saved. But for now, let's go back to that choice. The moment they thought they made the right call. The moment they thought the story was over. Because the next part, well, that's where everything starts to change. Where a mistake becomes a memory. And a memory becomes a connection, but not the kind you expect. It wasn't with Elaine or Peter. It wasn't even human. It was between two creatures, both lost, both silent. One domestic, one wild. Two animals who perchance were rescued within days of each other, and who, despite bars, fences, and species, found something that didn't need words. Peter was the one who said they did the right thing, that they'd had no choice, that there hadn't been time. But it was Elaine who carried the silence. The next morning she moved slowly, made coffee without speaking, stood by the window longer than usual, eyes fixed somewhere past the pines. Cody nudged her hand, but she didn't smile. The puppy, the one they'd saved, was resting in a blanket at the foot of the couch, bandaged for warm. He was safe. But safe didn't mean complete. Later that afternoon, Peter called the rescue center again, asked if the pup had a name. The volunteer said no, not yet. Peter suggested Scout. Elaine listened from the doorway, said nothing. Her hands were still damp from washing a bowl she didn't use. That night, she couldn't sleep again. When she finally got up, it wasn't dramatic. Just the quiet sound of socks on wood floors, the soft thump of a drawer closing, and then the door opening with care. She left a note on the table. It read simply, "I have to go back." Peter woke to Cody barking once softly. By the time he opened the door, Elaine was gone. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe just the place again, the shape of it, the memory. The dry creek bed was still there, the spot where the fur had tangled in thorns. She stood very still, watching, listening. Then she saw it. No movement, but not the same. There was a dent in the brush, a pattern in the dirt, and just barely, just enough to catch her breath, a tiny paw print, fresh, and then a second one deeper, like it had sunk. She didn't move closer. Instead, she whispered, "I see you." Elaine returned to the ranger station. This time, she didn't hold back. She told them everything. The puppy, the choice, the one they left behind. The ranger nodded calmly, but her hands moved quickly. She radioed a local wildlife rehab team and marked a grid on a small digital map. No judgment, no blame, just action. 3 hours later, the call came in. They'd found her, still in the same spot, still breathing. The team transported her to a rescue center just outside Flagstaff, specializing in wild animal rescue, especially orphaned or injured bobcat kittens. They'd seen many in the past, often too late. This one was different. They called her Juniper, not because she was strong or beautiful or fierce, but because she had survived alone beneath a tangle of dry branches that bore the name. Because she had blended into the forest until someone chose to come back. At the center, Juniper didn't cry. She didn't hiss or claw. She didn't move. Her breath was shallow, her eyes half open. One ear was badly torn, but her vitals were present, and that was enough. They stabilized her neck, wrapped her in a thermal blanket, and began the slow, uncertain process of helping her back. Elaine and Peter came by 3 days later. Scout was improving eating, even wagging, but something still lingered. He watched the door as if he expected someone else, as if someone was missing. Elaine walked quietly through the center's intake corridor. The smell of antiseptic and pine mixed oddly in the air. The room was warm. Juniper lay on her side in a padded kennel, barely moving. A volunteer spoke her name softly every few minutes, hoping for a response. Juniper blinked once. Peter stood beside Elaine. said nothing. Then finally, "We didn't just leave her. We didn't see her," Elaine answered. "But she was there." That distinction stayed with them, because sometimes regret isn't about what you did. It's about what you almost didn't notice, what you almost let disappear, and how easy it is to convince yourself that the wild will take care of its own. That's a myth, a comforting one. But many wild animals, especially babies like Juniper, don't survive without help. Injury trauma. Separation from a mother, it's often a death sentence. And bobcat kittens are especially vulnerable. They're shy, solitary, and often misread. They don't cry like domestic kittens. They don't beg. They go still, which makes them easy to miss, and even easier to justify walking away from. Elaine couldn't stop thinking about it. The way Juniper hadn't moved, hadn't asked, hadn't made a sound. There's something haunting about that. Something that stays with you long after the moment's gone. The weight of knowing that a life can be so small, so quiet, and still hang entirely in your hands. Peter tried to explain it later to a friend. He said, "It's like choosing between something that loves you and something that doesn't need you but still dies without you. That's the trap of the human heart. We're drawn to what reflects us. A puppy's eyes, a wagging tail, a tiny paw reaching out. But wild animals don't give us that. They give us mystery, distance, silence, and sometimes we mistake that for strength. We think they'll be fine without us, but sometimes they won't." Juniper's survival wasn't a miracle. It was the result of a second choice, the choice to go back, to admit they'd missed something, to let go of pride and lean into uncertainty. And that's the quiet lesson tucked into this part of the story. Compassion doesn't always show up on time, but it's still compassion if it comes back. The rescue center team worked around the clock. Fluids, heat, gentle cleaning, careful movement. They didn't know if Juniper would walk again, or see, or eat on her own. But they stayed, and slowly she responded. Very slowly. Elaine asked if she could visit, not to interfere, just to sit. The staff agreed. They let her sit on the other side of the glass. No touching, no noise, just presence. Elaine came every afternoon that week. She brought a sketch pad, drew trees. Cody, sometimes Juniper. She didn't show them to anyone. Peter stayed home with Scout, who was starting to act like himself again, tail wagging, ears perked, but he still had moments. Quiet spells, long stares at the door. One night, Peter saw him sleeping in front of the fireplace, curled tightly with his back to the flame. It reminded him of something. Then it hit him. That was how Juniper had lain in the kennel. The same way. He looked at Scout for a long moment and whispered, "You saw her too, didn't you?" It was a moment of recognition, of understanding that even animals, especially animals, carry memory, emotion, bond. They don't speak about it, but it's there. And so Peter made a call, asked if Scout could visit the center just once, just to see. They weren't expecting what happened next. When Juniper first arrived at the rescue center, she made no sound, not even the soft huffing noises bobcat kittens sometimes make when they're stressed. No cries, no warning growls, just stillness. She wouldn't eat unless food was left and everyone walked away. She didn't blink when someone entered the room. Her pupils didn't react to light the way they should have. There was no flinch when a hand passed in front of her eyes. Her body curled tight, her paws pulled inward like they didn't know how to open. In animal rescue, silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's the loudest alarm, Dr. Nina Caldwell had seen that kind of quiet before. She'd worked with wild animal rescue groups for over 2 decades. Bobcats, owls, foxes, creatures most people only ever see in cute animal videos or through a car window. But silence like Juniper's told her something else. Not just fear, not just shock, but shutdown. Juniper wasn't just hurt, she was gone inside. The MRI confirmed it: mild cranial trauma, soft swelling in the back right of the brain, likely from impact. No fractures, no bleeding. But that didn't mean she was okay. Neurological trauma is subtle. It can change everything: how an animal sees, walks, responds to motion or sound, even how they recognize their own body. In wild cats, especially young ones, it's hard to track. They don't communicate like dogs. They don't seek approval or affection. Bobcats are wired to hide pain. Survival depends on it, but Juniper's silence wasn't survival, it was withdrawal. The team used infrared cameras at night. She barely moved, just blinked once every so often. They started her on fluids, soft feeding, monitored temperature and pulse. Still no resistance, still no spark. Then one night, a volunteer named Rosa stayed late. She brought a blanket, soft, warm, unused, and set it on the floor beside Juniper's enclosure. She sat cross-legged, quietly sketching. After a while, she began whispering stories. Not to Juniper exactly, just into the room. She talked about her grandmother, about the pine trees, about losing her own cat last winter. She didn't expect a response. But around 10 p.m., the cameras caught Juniper move. Not much. Just the tilt of an ear, the twitch of a paw, and for the first time in days, she shifted her body, uncurling just slightly. Dr. Caldwell didn't call it progress, not yet, but she marked it: engaged stimulus. Over the next week, they introduced subtle exercises: a hanging feather, a small patch of fur, movement from a safe distance. No direct handling, just the slow rebuilding of instinct, and slowly, very slowly, Juniper began responding. She didn't trust, but she noticed. The wild cat baby they'd nearly missed was beginning to return. But here's where the story deepens. Because recovery in wildlife rescue isn't just about the body, it's about behavior. If Juniper didn't learn to respond to her surroundings again, she couldn't be released. She would either remain in captivity forever, or worse, be deemed unreleasable and not survive outside controlled conditions. That's a side of wildlife rehabilitation most people don't see. It's not just about healing wounds. It's about rewilding, about teaching a creature to remember what the wild asked of them. But with neurological trauma, that process can take weeks or never come at all. For Juniper, the turning point came not with medicine, but with Scout. They brought him in once a week, always supervised, always from a distance. He never barked, never growled. He would simply walk down the hallway until they reached Juniper's room. Then sit, watch, breathe. Juniper didn't respond the first time, or the second, but on the third visit, something subtle changed. She lifted her head, that was all, but it was everything. Dr. Caldwell made another note. Responsive motion. Animals, like people, don't heal on command. But sometimes presence does what medication can't. That idea of quiet companionship has growing support in behavioral science, especially among rescue animals. Researchers have observed that even across species, shared trauma can create a strange kind of recognition, a knowing, not language, not affection, but safety. And that's what Juniper needed most. Each time Scout returned, Juniper moved more. Her eyes tracked light, her breathing stabilized. She began lifting her head when food arrived. She still didn't make noise, but she blinked more often, moved more confidently. The staff noticed, so did the cameras. Eventually, Juniper began stretching during the night, reaching, turning her body to face the sound of Scout's steps. None of it was dramatic, no wagging tails, no paw-to-paw touching, just breath. Stillness. Watching. But that's the nature of bobcats. They don't show much, but what they do show you, don't forget. Rosa started calling her the quiet one who remembers. There's a lesson in that. In a world full of fast fixes and loud healing, sometimes the deepest kind of recovery happens in silence. Not through action, but through presence. Juniper didn't need to be cuddled. She didn't need to be tamed. She just needed space to feel safe again. And in Scout, another rescue animal with his own quiet scars, she found something steady. That's where animal companionship becomes something more than instinct. It becomes a shared language of survival, of patience, of memory. It's easy to forget that in the wild, animals don't often get second chances. Injuries don't come with rehab centers. Isolation usually means death. But here on this strange human-made path, they were rewriting that truth. Juniper was recovering. Slowly, she began grooming herself, one paw at a time. Her gait was still uneven, but her balance was returning. The neurological symptoms, trembling head tilt, were subsiding. She was tracking movement, watching light, watching Scout, not in fear, not in confusion, in recognition. One afternoon, Scout dropped something near the divider, a soft, knotted toy, his favorite. He backed away, sat down, watched. Juniper didn't move. But that evening, a volunteer found the toy pulled to her side. Not played with, not torn, just there, between her paws. Dr. Caldwell marked it again. Cross-object interaction. They didn't read too much into it. They didn't call it a friendship, or healing, or emotional attachment, but something real was happening. And that was enough. The day Scout didn't visit, no one said it out loud. But they all noticed. The morning routine at the rescue center was quiet. Staff moved between enclosures with practiced steps. Juniper had been more active lately, tracking shadows, blinking in rhythm with light. But that morning she lay still again, eyes dull, head low. She didn't look toward the door when it opened. She didn't shift when a bowl of food was slid gently into her space. She didn't twitch when the volunteer whispered her name. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Juniper ignored movement. Rosa wrote it down in her notes. Possible regression, no response to environmental cues. Scout was scheduled for a visit, but the couple fostering him, Elaine and Peter, had to cancel. A family emergency. Just a few days. Nothing major. But in a story like this, just a few days can echo louder than anyone expects. Back at the house, Scout seemed fine at first. He ate, he sniffed the corners, sat near the fireplace like always. But as evening came, he grew restless. He paced. At first, Peter thought it was the shift in routine. New smells, a missed walk. He offered toys. Scout sniffed and walked away. Elaine noticed something else. That night, Scout stood by the back door for over an hour. Ears perked, tail low, not barking, not whining, just standing, watching. The next morning, he didn't eat. And when Elaine brought out the soft blanket he always curled up in, he lay beside it instead, eyes open, body rigid, paws tucked under like he was bracing for something. They took him to the vet just to be safe. Nothing physically wrong, no fever, no infection, vitals normal. The vet looked thoughtful, then said gently, "Some animals grieve in silence, especially dogs who've bonded unexpectedly." Elaine didn't say anything, but the moment they got back in the car, she pulled out her phone and called the rescue center. "Is Juniper okay?" she asked. There was a pause on the other end. "She's quiet again," Rosa said. "Did something happen?" Scout hadn't seen Juniper in 3 days. Back at the center, Juniper had reverted to the same tight curl she'd arrived in, paws tucked head down. Her eyes tracked nothing. Her muscles stayed stiff. The trembling in her back leg returned. It's not uncommon in wildlife rescue. Animals don't always recover in straight lines. Progress comes in waves. But this didn't feel random. This felt like something had been taken away. The staff debated what to do. Reintroduce Scout too quickly and Juniper might grow dependent. Keep them apart too long and she might shut down completely. Dr. Caldwell offered a quiet suggestion. Let's try something simple. Let them see each other. No contact, just visual. The next day, Elaine and Peter drove Scout back to the center. As they approached the hallway, Scout slowed. His ears tilted, his steps grew careful. At the edge of the corridor, he stopped. Juniper's enclosure was just ahead. She was lying in her corner again, still, blanketed in light. Scout took one more step. Juniper's ears twitched. She turned her head. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic, but it was intentional. Their eyes met. No sound, no movement, just that silent knowing again. Scout lay down across from her. Juniper blinked, once, then twice, and this time she didn't look away. A small moment, easy to miss, but not to them. What followed over the next few days wasn't a dramatic shift. There were no miracles, no sudden recoveries, but things changed. Scout began eating again. He carried his knotted cloth toy around the house, setting it near Elaine's feet. He paced less, sat more. He even wagged his tail when Cody barked from the porch. At the center, Juniper responded to light again. She stretched her legs when music played in the corridor. Her eyes followed motion with a little more clarity. And perhaps most telling, when Scout visited again, she moved closer to the edge of her enclosure, lay parallel to where he sat, their bodies divided by wire, but aligned. There's a lesson in moments like this. People often think of wild and domestic animals as completely separate. One seeks connection, the other avoids it. But trauma levels the playing field. It strips away instinct and reveals something deeper, a need for presence. Not attention, not affection, just presence. That's something viewers often miss when watching cute animal videos or baby bobcat stories. They see the moments when things are fixed, but rarely the stillness in between. The long days when no one knows what's working, when healing looks like nothing. Scout wasn't Juniper's caretaker. He wasn't her playmate. He was something else, a constant. And in recovery, especially for rescue animals, that can mean more than any medication. Even wildlife rehabilitation experts admit that emotional well-being is still the least understood part of animal care. But it matters. Animals recovering from trauma, wild or domestic, respond to stability. Familiar sounds, predictable movement, a rhythm that reminds them they're not alone. Scout gave Juniper that rhythm. When he visited, her heartbeat slowed, her body loosened. She blinked more often. She even began reacting to feeding times with subtle paw motions, signs of awareness. Elaine and Peter watched all of it with quiet reverence. They asked once, if she starts to get better, does that mean they'll be together? Caldwell smiled. No, she said, but it means she'll have a chance. Elaine looked down at Scout. What about him? He's already had his Dr. Caldwell replied, but he chose to stay connected, a fresh perspective. Sometimes we expect animals to move on quickly, to forget, to bounce back, but like people, some carry things longer. Scout didn't need to be near Juniper. He wanted to be. And Juniper, in her quiet, wild way, began choosing presence too. There's a similar story from a wildlife center in Oregon where an orphaned fawn bonded with a retired sheepdog. They never touched, never played. But when separated, both stopped eating. The team reintroduced them through a fence. Within a week, both returned to normal. The bond didn't break rules. It reminded caregivers that sometimes nature doesn't need to be told how to heal. Recovery isn't always about what you give. Sometimes it's about what you keep showing up for. Scout kept showing up. So did Juniper. And slowly the weight of waiting turned into something steadier, something like hope. The charts said Juniper was healing, but the staff didn't need charts. They saw it in the way she stood just a little taller now, in the subtle shift of her body toward the light, in the flick of an ear when Scout's paws tapped down the corridor. It wasn't fast, it wasn't obvious, but it was happening. And yet if you asked the team how they did it, most of them would pause. Because some of the change couldn't be traced to medicine, or to the carefully measured feeding schedules, or to the therapy routines designed for wildcat rehabilitation. Some of it came from somewhere else. And in wildlife rescue, that's the space no one talks about enough. The quiet space between biology and belief. Juniper's vitals improved. Her reflexes became sharper. She started walking, not just moving across her enclosure. The trembling in her back leg diminished. The vet team began rotating enrichment objects in her space. She responded, swiped, tested textures, followed movement. They began prepping her for outside stimulation. Natural scents were brought in pine soil traces of other bobcats. Her eyes tracked the door when the wind shifted. Her muscles tensed the way wild cats do when something ancient flickers inside them. But that wasn't the part that convinced Rosa she was ready. It was the toy. Scout's faded cloth, the one he'd dropped outside her gate weeks earlier, had remained untouched for days. But one morning it was gone from its spot. The camera caught her dragging it gently toward the shaded corner of her enclosure. She didn't tear it, didn't play. She just placed it there. Between her paws, she watched it like a memory. That same day when Scout visited, she didn't just blink. She stepped closer to the gate, sat, waited. Her breathing was steady, her eyes alert, and for the first time when Scout left, she stayed where she was. She didn't curl, didn't retreat. She stayed present. For many, that wouldn't seem significant, but for the staff who had watched her arrive, broken silent near catatonic, it meant everything. Not just because she was improving, but because she was beginning to hold space on her own. That's the line that separates rescue from release. Not whether the animal is alive, but whether they're whole enough to return. Bobcats are solitary. They're not meant to live in pairs. And Juniper, at her core, was still wild. She had never purred, never rubbed against the gate. She remained distant guarded, but her instincts were back, and something else had returned too. Awareness. Scout's presence had done something they couldn't explain fully. It hadn't tamed her. It hadn't changed her nature. But it had steadied her. Reminded her perhaps that not every shadow meant danger, that silence could also mean safety. Behavioral science supports this animal-assisted recovery, has been used with domestic species for years. Dogs comforting dogs, horses calming trauma patients, but between a puppy and a wild cat, that doesn't make the textbooks. Yet here they were. Dr. Caldwell had seen strange things in her year's owls that responded only to one handler's voice. A fox that refused food unless placed near a particular tree branch, but this bond was different. It wasn't emotional in the human sense. It wasn't romanticized, but it was real. They'd become companions in presence, healed not through touch, but through proximity. And that's something viewers don't often realize when watching wild animal rescue stories. They see the end, the soft release, the cute animal walking into the woods. But the middle, the slow, awkward, painful return to instinct is where the real work happens. It's also where science sometimes steps aside to make space for something older. Elaine said it best. They just understood something we didn't. Scout never barked at Juniper, never pawed, never demanded, and she never flinched at him. Their rhythm was silent but steady, like watching two clocks ticking at the same pace on opposite sides of a wall. Over the next few weeks, Juniper's progress continued. She climbed, she crouched, she pounced. She was hunting again, not real prey, but behaviorally accurate simulations designed by the team. Movements sharpened, balance restored, eye tracking aligned. Her medical chart listed her condition as fully responsive, release eligible. But Scout didn't know that, and that's where the story began to bend. Because healing in nature often means separation, but for Juniper and Scout, their stories had overlapped long enough to leave an imprint. Elaine and Peter noticed it too. Scout had returned to most of his habits, eating, exploring, greeting guests, but every Sunday morning when they drove to the center, something in him changed. His tail stiffened, his ears twitched, his eyes locked on the road. He knew. When they reached the building, he walked ahead, straight down the hallway. No hesitation. And when Juniper appeared just a flicker behind the mesh, he slowed. Lay down. She walked toward him now, confident, poised, not dependent, but present. They sat like that every week. Quiet, still, breathing in sync. No one trained them to do it. No one told them they had to, but it became the pulse of the rescue center, this silent moment between a once-abandoned puppy and a once-forgotten bobcat baby. The morning of Juniper's release was quiet in a different kind of way. Not the kind of quiet that comes with stillness. This one had to shape, weight, like everyone was holding something invisible and didn't want to drop it. The staff moved softer than usual. Voices lowered, doors opened slower. Scout walked in early with Elaine and Peter, ears twitching at every step. He didn't pull on the leash like he usually did. He didn't race to the end of the corridor. He just walked, deliberate, aware. Juniper was already in her crate, tucked behind a thin canvas drape for calm. She didn't resist, didn't claw. She'd stepped in on her own. Rosa had placed a pine branch inside one that had been in her enclosure from the beginning. And near her paw, Scout's old toy. Not for play, just presence. Elaine crouched beside Scout as he sat, eyes fixed on the crate he couldn't see through. She ran her hand along his back. He didn't wag. He didn't whimper. He just stayed still. There were no goodbyes. Only understanding. For the Wildlife Center, this was the goal. A successful bobcat rehabilitation ending in a healthy release into protected wild terrain. But no one felt celebratory. Not yet. Outside, the sky was wide and pale. The wind cooled the pine trees, swaying like they knew what was coming. They loaded Juniper's crate gently into the back of a van lined with padded blankets. No cameras, no applause, just steady breath. The van pulled away without a word. Scout watched until the tires disappeared behind the trees. Then he turned back to Elaine, lowered his head and leaned gently against her knee. The release site was about 20 miles outside of Flagstaff, deep enough to be safe, quiet enough to be home. It was an area where bobcats had been tracked before, where prey was available and human presence was limited. Juniper's door opened slowly. She paused once at the edge, nose lifting to catch the air. Her eyes scanned, focus darted. Then without sound, she stepped out. She didn't run. She didn't bolt. She walked, one foot in front of the other. And then like a flicker, she was gone, back into the wild. The forest took her gently. Back at the rescue center, things felt incomplete. Scout lingered near the enclosure hallway the next day, not pacing, not searching, just sitting, watching the spot where Juniper used to be. He stayed there until Elaine finally called softly. He came without resistance, but slower than usual. That night he curled not in his usual place by the window, but at the foot of the couch just beside Elaine's feet. He didn't move when she stood, just opened one eye, watched her walk away, and then closed it again. Some bonds don't need a lifetime to matter. Sometimes just a few quiet weeks is enough. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't replace what was shared. It simply makes room for what comes next. In wildlife rescue, the goal is always return. That's the mission. To heal, release, restore balance. But when that balance touches something personal, something emotional, it leaves a mark that doesn't fade with distance. Dr. Caldwell has seen it before. A hawk that refused to fly until a specific volunteer arrived. A raccoon who only ate when a certain song played nearby. She told Rosa once, the hardest part of this job isn't the injuries, it's the exits. Because animals don't say goodbye. They don't wave. They don't look back. But we do. We wait for that one last glance that never comes. And somehow, we carry the moment anyway. Scout didn't bark, didn't pull toward the woods. But for days after Juniper's release, he moved with more care. He sniffed slower, looked longer at the trees. Peter started calling it his lookout time. Elaine noticed it too. Scout would sit in the yard facing the woods even when nothing moved. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. She asked Peter, "Do you think he knows she's gone?" Peter said, "No, I think he knows she's free." Here's a truth we don't talk about often. Letting go is an act of love, not the absence of it. When people watch emotional animal rescue videos, they usually hope for the reunion. The happy ending where the puppy and the bobcat live together, play, grow old, side by side. That's the fairy tale we're trained to want. But in real life, especially in wild animal rescue, it's not about attachment. It's about restoration. Juniper didn't belong in a house, or a kennel, or even in a bond that held her back. She belonged to the mountains, the trees, the echoing silence of her instincts, and Scout somehow seemed to understand that. His love didn't pull her in. It released her. A month after Juniper was released, the staff at the rescue center received a photo. No words. No name. Just a motion-triggered camera, still a bobcat lean and alert, crossing a rocky ledge near a dry riverbed. Her posture was balanced, head forward, confident. Rosa stared at the photo for a long time. It wasn't confirmation, they couldn't be sure, but her eyes the shape of the scar near one ear. Something in the way she held herself, it looked like Juniper. The image was time-stamped just after sunrise, not far from the original rescue site. It wasn't a reunion, but it was enough. Back at the house, Scout was pacing again, not distressed, not anxious, just aware. He sat near the window more often now, sometimes by the garden gate, sometimes under the pine tree in the back, not looking for something, just staying open as if something might come. Elaine noticed a shift in him, not a sadness, a kind of calm. He'd gone from rescue puppy to companion, and now to witness. Peter said, "I think he's holding space." Elaine nodded. For who Peter smiled, for whatever needs it. This story wasn't supposed to be remarkable. Just another wild animal rescue, a bobcat baby found injured, treated, released. A puppy brought in from abandonment, adopted, healed. Separate paths, clean endings. But sometimes the stories we remember are the ones that don't follow the rules, the ones that leave a space behind. At its core, this wasn't just about a baby bobcat, or a sweet rescue dog, or even about the humans who stepped in. It was about the quiet possibilities that open up when presence meets patience. It was about what happens when we stop rushing to define things, when we let relationships unfold in the way nature intended, unpredictable, gentle, real. The bond between Scout and Juniper was never measured in affection or play. It was defined by stillness, by breath, by awareness. Two animals, one wild. One domestic, sharing time through a fence, both recovering from trauma and giving each other something no one else could, a reason to stay in the present. Not every wild animal rescue story makes room for that. But this one did. It changed how the staff approached future intakes. They began considering environmental pairing more carefully, not in terms of closeness or familiarity, but rhythm, energy. The way animals sense each other without words. They added observation blocks into the weekly schedule. Not to do anything but to sit quietly near the enclosures, to listen more, move less. Even the volunteers noticed. One said, "It feels less like a clinic now, more like a place where things come back to life." The changes were subtle, but they stayed. And Scout, he came back once more. The center invited Elaine and Peter to visit the education wing where local school children learned about wildlife rescue. Scout lay on a mat near the front of the room. He didn't bark or perform, just sat, calm, grounded. When a child asked, "Do you think the bobcat misses him?" Elaine answered simply, "I think she remembers him. And maybe that's even better." There's a real-life example like this from Colorado. A mountain lion cub who lost her siblings in a fire. She was rescued, but her condition was fragile. She didn't respond to humans, didn't eat. The team tried a new approach, pairing her enclosure near a calm adult rescue deer. They didn't touch, didn't interact. But within days, her heartbeat slowed. Her behavior changed. She began eating, moving. No science could explain it, but it worked. What we've learned again and again is that healing doesn't always look like fixing. Sometimes it looks like holding space for the broken parts to feel safe enough to return. This story reminds us that the lines we draw between wild and domestic, between logic and feeling, aren't always where the truth lives. Sometimes truth lives in the silence between a puppy's breath and a bobcat's stillness. Sometimes wild animal rescue isn't just about wildlife. It's about rediscovering something human in the process. So if you're watching this, maybe ask yourself, Where have you been silent lately? What part of you needs presence, not advice? What if healing didn't mean going back to who you were but becoming something steadier than before? And more than that, who have you sat quietly beside even without words? Maybe you were Scout. Maybe you were Juniper. Maybe at some point you were both. If this story stirred something in you, hold it gently. Let it remind you of the strength in stillness, the softness of letting go, the quiet power of simply being there for someone, animal or human, without needing anything back. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is the one where we say, "You're free to go, and I will remain." If you believe in the power of animal companionship, wildcat rescue, and quiet healing, please take a moment to like this video. It helps others find stories like this. Subscribe to join us for more journeys, some small, some unexpected, or worth holding on to. Every story shared here brings awareness to real wildlife rescue and animal rehabilitation efforts. And every click is a small act of care. Thank you for watching, for feeling, for staying. We'll see you in the next story.